Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 9th Annual Kennedy Memorial Debate. Thank you. Between UC Berkeley and UCLA. Way back in 1964, when we started this debate, it was run a little differently. We had 6 debaters instead of 4, and we followed a different format. We had several resolutions prepared by somebody who was an expert in the field that we had selected of U.S. foreign policy, which in the first one happened to be U.S. foreign policy in Africa. We therefore asked the Honorable G. Menon Williams, Under Secretary of State for African Affairs, to make 4 or 5 debatable resolutions for us. He then sent those to the debate coach that we had chosen in the area here to make the final selection just 2 weeks before the debate. And that was Dr. Henry McGuckin, Director of Forensics at what was then San Francisco State College. And he selected the topic, but this was not given to the 6 debaters until 3 hours before the debate. Then they went into 6 separate rooms and worked up their cases. We've changed that, obviously. We have 4 debaters on the platform. Each school provides 1 on the affirmative and 1 on the negative. It's an individual debate, and the winner receives the Kennedy Medal, which is a medal with the 2 Kennedy brothers profiled on it, and it's a very handsome piece. It says UCLA Kennedy Memorial Debate 1974, and one of the 4 gentlemen up here will be carrying that away. We were notified about a half hour ago, due to the gas shortage, even an assemblyman is unable to get gas at the end of the month. So the Honorable John Miller sends his greetings from Sacramento and is relying on the objectivity of the other 4 judges to be certain that the best man wins. Taking our judges as they're listed in alphabetical order, very happy to welcome back Professor Jack Hasling, Department of Speech and former Director of Forensics at Foothill College, who has also served as a judge in the Medaille d'Or between Cal and Stanford. Jack, would you stand and take a bow? Let's hear it for Jack. Sir John Gay is the debate coach at the California State University of San Francisco, and we have known him through the contest with Berkeley and San Francisco, known as the Meiklejohn Memorial Debate. We're very happy to have John present with us. John, will you take a bow? Also, the winner of the last Meiklejohn is present with us too, Ken Baris. Ken, happy to have you with us. We're happy to welcome back again a judge who has served us several times in all 3 of the platform debates, the Honorable Winton McKibben, Judge of the Oakland Municipal Court. Win. And for the last judge, I have a citation to read. The Honorable Lionel Wilson. On the 8th day of May, 1962, you served as one of our 5 distinguished judges on the occasion of the 68th Annual Medaille d'Or debate between Stanford and California, the oldest uninterrupted intercollegiate debate in the world. Subsequently, you served at the 74th, the 78th, and this year at the 79th Annual d'Or. On April 28, 1970, you judged the 4th Annual Meiklejohn Memorial Debate between UC Berkeley, California State University at San Francisco, a contest centered on civil liberties to honor the great civil libertarian Alexander Meiklejohn. When we launched the Kennedy Memorial Debate between UC Berkeley and UCLA, you were present to judge the 1st annual contest, a contest featuring U.S. foreign policy as the Joffre focuses on France and the Meiklejohn on civil liberties. You joined us at the 2nd Kennedy debate. Tonight we welcome you to the 9th Kennedy Memorial Debate. You have thus served faithfully and well four outstanding educational institutions: UC Berkeley, UCLA, California State University at San Francisco, and Stanford. It is our custom, one of our generous citizens served us 8 times in this exacting task, to express our appreciation by taking special note of that generosity and that expertise. Having enjoyed the precious favor of your personal friendship, predating even your long tenure of debate judge, it is an unusually rich privilege for me, by virtue of the power vested in me as Director of Forensics, with accompanying gratitude from all 4 universities, to confer upon you the honorary degree entitled Friend of Forensics. Happy to announce that this is a class night for us, and I'm sure that our visitors will excuse us for making 2 quick announcements. At the Northbridge tournament, Enda Brennan took first place in impromptu. Let's hear it for Enda. And at the Blue Devil at Merced, Rick Hill took first place in expository. Let's hear it for Rick. By any chance did David Dansky appear? He's the Director of Forensics at Kennedy High School in Richmond, and wanted to make an announcement tonight if he could make it. He hasn't made it. We'll go ahead now into the debate of the evening. You have the history of the debate on the back page of the program. You have the topic of the debate on the 3rd page. You have the names of the debaters, and it is always our custom never to list the university alongside the debaters, because when UCLA debaters are up here, we want them to be judged fairly. When we're down there, we want to be judged fairly, so we don't put the name of the school next to the debater. Now, the order in which they will appear is on the board here. They flipped to see who would be first and second in the respective cases. So we'll be hearing first affirmative from Brad Webb, first negative Arnold Clark, second affirmative Royal Oakes, and second negative David Green. Then in the rebuttal period, those positions are reversed. The negative goes first and the affirmative second. I am going to sit down and enjoy the debate, so I won't stay up here. But when it comes time for the rebuttal, I will check with Neil about the time that is left for each debater. Each debater has 15 minutes overall to present his case and his rebuttal, and the maximum that he may have in the rebuttal is 7 minutes. Otherwise, he may juggle his time any way he desires. 9, 6, 10, 5, any combination that he wants to use. So on the topic of the debate tonight, resolved that all U.S. military personnel to be withdrawn from Europe. We'll hear first from our first affirmative, Brad Webb.
At last count, U.S. forces in Europe numbered 319,000 men. Today, we are here to examine the wisdom of this commitment. I believe that commitment is unwise, and therefore support the resolution that all U.S. military personnel should be withdrawn from Europe. This should probably take the form of a 2 to 5 year phase-out of all our ground forces in Europe. I will advance 3 arguments in support of the resolution. My first argument is that our physical presence in Europe has outlived its usefulness. Our original purpose in sending troops to Europe in NATO's formative period was to bolster the morale of the still weak European member states and to maintain internal order. No one seriously argues such points today. Rather, the argument is usually raised to justify our troop commitments in Europe is that they are needed to counterbalance the Russian threat. Actually, the vast majority of Warsaw Pact troops are not Russian, but Eastern European. It is ridiculous to even imagine a Russian invasion of Europe. Russia has too much to lose, even if she just employs a, quote, show of force. She has billions of dollars worth of trade with the Western European nations, which she would lose, and she would be ostracized internationally. Russia has absolutely nothing to gain by using her military strength. If she really wanted to threaten Europe, she would do so by manipulating her Arab allies to cut off Europe's oil. It is precisely because Russia recognizes the futility of her military weapons that she is attempting to control the world's supply of oil. Indeed, our forces in Europe are useless against the only possible weapon which Russia can use against Western Europe, the threat of cutting off their oil. Senator J.W. Fulbright probably was not exaggerating when he noted, "It really seems to me that the stability of the U.S. at the moment, or its instability, is a much greater hazard to the future of Europe than a Russian invasion." Our troop commitment does not even make military sense. According to the estimates of the Brookings Institute in their book, Setting National Priorities, the 1974 budget, it would take the Soviet Union 30 to 90 days to ready a force for the invasion of Western Europe. The U.S. could ship troops over to Europe during such a buildup. Finally, if Russia attacked Europe, our conventional forces there would not prevent us from having to rely on nuclear weapons. That noted Senate hawk, Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, has said, "In all the years I have been connected with the military, and that's quite a few, I have never known a single military expert who felt the forces of NATO could contain a major Soviet attack against Europe without the use of nuclear weapons." Our NATO commitments are more traditional than rational. They are a function of bureaucratic inertia and an unwillingness to risk rocking the boat in Western Europe, rather than an objective assessment of the requirements of the age. Yes, our physical presence in Europe has outgrown its usefulness. Secondly, I will argue that our military expenditures in Europe constitute a significant economic burden for the United States. According to the latest figures, we spend 2% of our GNP, or $17 billion a year, defending Europe. If these troops were dismantled once they returned home, we could save all those dollars to spend on the hundreds of social needs which go unfulfilled in this country today. Our military support of Europe also places a financial burden on the United States by aggravating our balance of trade deficit. There are 319,000 American troops in Europe, some 230,000 dependents, and over 14,000 civilian employees. Thus, there are in total over 560,000 Americans in Europe today either serving in the military or connected with the military. It costs huge amounts of money to support these troops. Our European allies have tried to soften this burden by buying arms from us, reevaluating their currency, and pledging that dollar reserves would not be converted into gold. Without these favors, 46.1% of our balance of trade deficit would come from our military expenditures in Europe. When you include these favors, the net balance of trade deficit is 30.5%. Senator Stuart Symington writes, "Net military expenditures in Western Europe still constitute 30.5% of the total balance of payments deficit in 1970. Senator Mike Mansfield writes, "These expenditures represent a drain on the dollar, and act to weaken its international position. Salaries and other indirect costs eat heavily into U.S. tax resources, leaving less for essential purposes at home and adding severe inflationary pressures to the economy." Whenever proposals are made to cut our troop levels in Europe, there always arise hues and cries from the countries where our troops are stationed. The leaders of these countries protest that their security would be threatened by our withdrawals. All that would really be threatened is their pocketbooks. My last argument for eliminating our troop commitment to Europe is philosophical. Our commitment of troops to Europe is an outgrowth of the belief that we can and should solve the world's problems through military force. We cannot continue to be protector of the world. When we exercise such enormous power, we use it to try and impose our will upon other nations. U.S. News and World Report reported November 12, 1973. European leaders were snapping back in private notes to Mr. Nixon that the U.S. was trying to impose a pro-Israel policy on them contrary to their essential interests, headed by their dependence on oil from the Arab nations. In Paris, French officials contended that in the Mideast, as earlier in Vietnam, U.S. interests were shown as different from those of Europe. Our physical presence in Europe also dangerously ties us to European problems. a West Germany invasion of East Germany for the purpose of reunification, or a British intervention over the Suez Canal are at least as likely events as a Russian invasion of Europe. If the bullets started flying and the bombs falling, we would be in the middle of a conflict which is contrary to our interests and indeed in the interests of peace for the entire world. We believe that whatever the communists do, we need to counter, that any unilateral relaxation of our military stance is a sign of weakness. This amounts to an arrogance of pride. This same arrogance of pride was responsible for the slaughter of thousands of people in Vietnam because we wanted to fight for an honorable peace. Our commitment of troops in Europe started over 2.5 decades ago. It signaled the start of the Cold War. Today, the policies of the Cold War persist. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. The time has come for the Cold War to fade away. The reconstruction of Europe has ended. It seems ridiculous to me that 260 million people in Western Europe, with tremendous industrial resources, continue after 2.5 decades to depend on 220 million Americans for their defense. They want us to defend Western Europe against 200 million Russians who are contending with 800 million Chinese. Somehow, the logic of that situation fails me. Foreign policy in the United States has historically had a conservative tendency. Policy becomes mortarbound, stagnating in a sea of bureaucratic inertia. Policies outlive their usefulness and become a weighty albatross upon the neck of our nation, which persists in its obsolete ways. Just such an obsolete policy is our commitment of troops in Western Europe. The time to reevaluate this commitment has arrived. It's time to bring all the troops back home.
First negative, Arnold Clark.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of ourselves, the University of California, to whom we owe this room, and America's vast military-industrial complex, I also bid you welcome. David and I have assumed the slightly awesome and seemingly odious task of defending our troop commitment in Europe today. We also call that the Nato Alliance. It is a task that's made, unfortunately, much more difficult when we consider the impressive array of international experts and leaders whom also have joined the ranks of the opposition in advocating withdrawal from European soil. This is a list that, as I recall, includes such great men as Charles de Gaulle, but he's dead, so I guess that doesn't count. It also includes, however, Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern, but they don't count either because they lost. However, President Richard Nixon says that we should keep our troops in Europe, and that's probably another strike against us. Now, however, Senators Fulbright, Longdale, Cranston, and Mansfield have all also joined the ranks of the opposition in saying we should withdraw from NATO. And now, to our great dismay, Misters Brad Webb and Royal Oaks have also joined the ranks of the opposition. And now you know trouble looms large for the negative in this evening's debate. Nevertheless, I am convinced and I am confident that at the end of this hour we will have you convinced, as we indeed ourselves are convinced, that we should keep our troops in Europe. It is a belief that I will support bereft of a manuscript. I am a firm believer in spontaneous generosity and argumentation, but I would like to advance 3 ideas, so I hope you'll bear with me, manuscript without. I would first like to place the entire question of NATO in the broad international context of policymaking, of which it is but a small part. Then I would like to address the 3 reasons why I believe we should stay in NATO, and finally I would like to address the argumentation that Mr. Webb has just put forth. Now, in terms of the broader context of international policy making, there are 3 truisms that I've discovered in the last couple of hours of research. The first is that international policy making is a very subtle beast indeed. Things are never quite as they seem. Take, for example, the Guatemalan invasion in '58, where we invaded to save the poor natives from the rough hands of the communists, when in fact we invaded to save our fruit interests there. Well, in much the same way, the rhetoric of NATO is not as it seems, and that, I believe, will become clear. We are not in there to stop the massive overhauling of European soil by the Soviet troop hordes. Rather, we were in there for very different and subtle diplomatic reasons, which I will explicate in a moment. The second truism I've discovered in the broader frame of international policy making is that policy making rationale is always changing. We begin a situation for entirely different reasons than we continue to become involved in that situation. Vietnam is a perfect case in point. We initially involved ourselves there to free the South Vietnamese from the dire hands of the communists. We finally left there under the pretense that we were protecting our troops and ensuring their safe exit. Clearly, our reasons are always changing. But perhaps most importantly, in the broadest frame of all, is that truisms in an international sense are morally ambiguous. There are actions which will reap very tangible rewards, but cannot morally be justified. War itself is the prime case in point, where you have people given jobs, the economy gets a shot in the arm, and so forth, but that's certainly no justification for keeping it. And I only mention that because there will be reasons, perhaps, why we should stay in NATO, that Mr. Green might offer you, that I frankly cannot defend morally. Now, the upshot of all of this is that the picture that we are confronted with is a very, very murky one, and the policy guidelines that we must use to determine whether or not we stay in NATO are equally murky. I would, however, attempt to clarify them for you by the following three-part defense of NATO. I will take what in debaters' jargon is a very stock organization. I think we should stay in NATO for military, economic, and political reasons. First, in the sphere of military, and I say that with bated breath because I'm not quite sure how it will be received, I believe that there are certain military reasons which mandate our staying in Europe with our troops. And I see personally three of those reasons. In the first place, it prevents a European nuclear armament. Now, if we take our troops and our nuclear weapons and flee home, as Mr. Webb suggests, what are the Europeans going to do? Are they going to sit idly by and trust in the promise of the United States to launch a nuclear attack should the Soviets transgress against their sovereignty? Or are the Europeans simply going to say, well, we've entered a new era of peace and do nothing? They are not going to do either of those things, ladies and gentlemen. They are going to develop their own nuclear arsenal, and according to Dr. Ralph Lapp in his famous book, Nuclear Armament of 1969, nuclear armament and proliferation is among the gravest threats that confront the world today. If you have a complete absence of U.S. forces in Europe, you are going to find the Europeans taking the gauntlet up and defending themselves. This is the opinion of no less an expert than Samuel Huntington of Harvard in 1969. The credibility of the U.S. commitment to her European allies grows weaker by the year. The more tenuous our commitment becomes, the more certain the prospects of European nuclear armament becomes. I do not wish to risk a nuclear war, and so I would say keep the troops in. Secondly, however, in the military sphere, by keeping our troops there, we prevent a heightened nuclear arms race with the Russians themselves. And the analysis is simply this. Now, maybe not in your minds, and maybe not in our minds, the troop race in Europe doesn't seem very real, and the threat of an actual troop war doesn't seem very real either. However, to the Russians it's real, and certainly to our own government leaders it's real. So what does the troop race do? It provides a buffer to the nuclear arms race, and this is the opinion of Dr. Francis Beer, a political science professor at Ohio State in 1970. He says that while admittedly the prospects of a troop confrontation in Eastern Europe is very slight indeed, the fact is that such troop buildups acts as a buffer to a direct nuclear confrontation and the dangers of a heightened nuclear arms race. The myth of troop war is indeed a myth. The myth of a nuclear war is not a myth, it is a reality. And that is why we must maintain our troops in Europe. However, thirdly, in the military sphere, I would argue that keeping our troops there prevents a constant testing of U.S. mettle by Russia. Now, we might not believe that the Soviets have ill intentions, but I believe believe their actions indicate otherwise. You have seen pretty well what they've done during the oil crisis. They've exploited that to the fullest capacity possible. What you might not know is that only 2 weeks ago, the Soviets demanded of the Icelandic government, a very small nation located in the cold, windy Atlantic, that they disallow the United States from keeping any troops there under threats of being cut off of all oil. I believe that the Soviet Union is not a well-intentioned giant, that they will exploit any opportunity given to them. And certainly the oil crisis indicates that. If we remove our troops from Europe, we will see a constant testing of U.S. metal. If, however, the military arguments do not convince you, there is a second entire line of argumentation, and that is that economically we must keep our troops in Europe. And that is to guard against a vicious European energy competition, and I believe we can expect that competition. Britain, for example, wouldn't allow us to use our Cyprus bases in the Arab-Israeli oil crisis. France, for example, sent arms to Saudi Arabia, and as you all know, have a huge agreement with the Iranians to exchange oil for troops for the Iranians. Now, the point is this, that if we remove our troops, they are going to start at taking advantage of things to their own best advantage. What they're going to do is they're going to say, well, the United States is not going to take care of us, so let us simply realign ourselves with the most powerful nation on earth, which of course would be the Soviet Union. There's a quotation that I'd like to read to you that I believe proves the point. It's from Foreign Affairs magazine in 1974, from a man named Mr. Harlan Cleveland, who was a NATO administrator for no less than 5 years. He says that if we withdraw from NATO, collective European defense would collapse and the separate states would retreat into hopeful neutralism, scrambling over each other to reach some accommodation with the Russians. If we don't have our troops there, that's a pretty clear sign that we're not that interested in European affairs. That gives them the go-ahead then to start smacking up or trying to take advantage of the Russians' position. And to that extent, that would very, very seriously jeopardize European interests in the world energy market, and I believe the United States would suffer for that reason. The third and final reason I believe we should stay in NATO is strictly political. And it might sound a bit bizarre, but I believe that keeping our troops there actually encourages and protects the guarantee of a U.S.-Soviet détente. Now, you might not have been aware of this fact, but in 1968, when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia, their prime defense within their own lands was the threat of, you guessed it, U.S. aggression against the Soviet Union. Pravda newspaper in 1968, just after the Czech invasion, said this: if we allowed sovereignty within the European socialist community, NATO forces would advance to the Soviet border. Now, as you all know, diplomacy is a game of patting one another on the back. By keeping U.S. forces in Europe, we give the Russians an excuse to keep their forces in Eastern Europe. If we did not give them that excuse and withdrew all of our forces, that would mean that every time the Soviet Union experienced a threat from the nations within their satellite, you would see an increased polarization. The Russians would have no excuse but the obvious fact that they're repressing these countries to come in and smash any rebellion that the satellite countries might pose to the Soviet hegemony. Now, to that extent, it would cause a polarization between the Soviet Union, forced to use aggressive tactics without the benefit of an excuse, and the United States, which, as we all know, stands for peace and freedom throughout the world today. These are the reasons that I believe we should keep in our forces in Europe. They are military, political, and economic. Now, Mr. Webb says that we don't have any physical reason to keep our troops there, that they've outlived their usefulness. I think I've denied that. We're not trying to bolster European morale, nor maintain internal orders. The arguments are much more sophisticated. He talks about an economic burden and talks about $17 billion. But that's $2 billion for troops and about $15 billion for nuclear weapons and amenities. But the real point is, if we didn't spend that money there, the military would simply sop up that $17 billion and spend it somewhere else. So he can't claim that we pump the money into social programs. The military-industrial complex certainly wouldn't allow that. Finally, philosophically, he says that the U.S. has assumed the burden of the world's problems. I am suggesting we assume the burden of avoiding nuclear proliferation, which could end this world as we know it, and that we should avoid economic and political collapse, which I believe keeping our troops there do. NATO is a vehicle to world peace, and I think if we take an enlightened, sophisticated view toward the diplomacy of the 1970s and 80s, we will all be forced to conclude with just that conclusion.
Second affirmative, royal votes.
Counter the last speaker's tactics, may I suggest that I have it on good authority that John Dean, John Ehrlichman, and the Boston Strangler all support our troops in Western Europe. May I begin by saying that I'm pleased and honored to take part in the Berkeley debates here. I would say, however, that the nature of America's commitment, with all due respect to the last speaker's arguments, in Europe leads me to believe that the letters in the phrase NATO should rather stand for needless and tenuous outlays instead of North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think a story I heard recently might typify the arguments I'm going to be issuing. In the frozen tundra of the Arctic perimeter, the Eskimos have a rather bizarre means of hunting wolves. They cover their sharpest knives with fresh blood, and they stick them point up in the snow. The wolf's exemplary sense of smell proves to be his downfall, for he detects the blood and begins licking the knife. Soon to his temporary delight, his meal seems to grow in size and freshness, until at last he collapses and dies, having consumed his own life-giving blood. In America's policy towards Western Europe, America is following the lead of the Arctic wolf. For surely we are figuratively, if not literally, drowning in our own blood by following a course which commits hundreds of thousands of men and billions of dollars to a cause which is needless every year. Before I issue the arguments which I would think refute the idea of Western European troops, please permit me to go over the arguments that have been issued heretofore. The last speaker initially indicated that, well, we've looked at the past precedents all wrong, that in Guatemala, for example, we didn't invade for altruism, but instead for our fruit interest, in spite of the fact that the government never told us that. Now, for one who recognizes that the government does indeed patently lie to us and is devious in our foreign policy, I find it doubly curious that he would support a government which would want the troops in Western Europe. He next, however, tells you that, quote, truisms in an international sense are morally ambiguous. Now that may be profound. It goes a little over my head, and I don't understand how it justifies the troops in Western Europe. He says next that militarily we need to prevent European armament, but they are arming today, and as I will indicate, there is no reason to doubt our nuclear commitment would be any less if we withdrew our conventional troops. He next, however, said that economically they would collapse. I will argue later on they can defend themselves. And finally, he says that, well, politically we need the troops, because having those troops over there encourages the détente. Now this I don't understand. In Czechoslovakia or in Eastern Germany, the Russian soldiers are sitting there and looking across the border at 300,000 American troops. And Boris says to Ivan, look at all those 300,000 troops. And Ivan says, yeah, that's what they call détente over there. I would suggest this is patently, of course, ridiculous. The fact that we have all those troops does not mean we have a détente. Finally, he tells you in his concluding remark, the military would sop up the money elsewhere, of course. Number one, the gentleman does not evidence that at all. I would argue later on that if we can get rid of the $17 billion, it could perhaps go to the needed social programs that are now neglected by the government. But more importantly, why do you support a government and a military institution which you admit would simply sop up all this money if we cut out NATO, if in fact you think that is legitimate? I do not see the logic behind that. In terms of my specific arguments, I think that three major questions have to be asked in this debate. The answer, I think, to all three of them is no, but if the answer to any of them is no, I think we should remove the troops from Western Europe. The first question is Europe incapable of defending herself? The second question is the Soviet Union a credible invasion threat? And third, are the benefits of the American presence enough to outweigh the tremendous drawbacks that exist? First, is Europe incapable of defending herself? Senator William Proxmire noted in July of 1973, West Germany, on the basis of per capita income, is the richest nation in the world, and along with the other nations in NATO, could easily afford to provide its own defense without American assistance. You are confronted, ladies and gentlemen, with a policy which commits 300,000 Americans every single year, which I will indicate later on racks our balance of payment system, causes drug addiction to skyrocket among the soldiers, and you are looking at a country which is the richest richest in the world, and its compatriots, which we are told as of 1973, can totally defend themselves. I see no mandate for maintaining the troops over that in that realm. Secondly, however, the question of whether the Soviet invasion is a credible threat. I would suggest it is not for a couple of reasons. The first is that there have been no actions in recent years to believe that the Soviet Union has any intention of breaking through the Iron Curtain. We are carrying through a policy that was created in 1949. We have to reassess that policy for the modern aspects of the world situation, and Russia is simply not that threat. The Atlantic Alliance has become less relevant because the détente we have with Russia has diminished the possibility of an invasion. The study Elusive Enemy in 1972 concluded, the Atlantic Alliance, less relevant today when the dominant threat around which it developed has lost much of its urgency and credibility, and the détente began between the United States and the Soviet Union. I would suggest the final reason why they would not invade is that world public opinion would prevent such an invasion. Now, the Russian bear is not the vicious grizzly it once was. Who in this room could doubt that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, had he criticized the government 20 years ago to the extent he is criticizing them today, would not be dead? He is not dead, of course, and Russian attention to world opinion is clearly a formidable force. The third question we must ask is, are the benefits of the American presence enough to outweigh the tremendous drawbacks that exist? I read somewhere that if the entire population of Red China all jumped off of a 6-foot platform at once, it would cause such an earth tremor that California would crack off into the sea. Now, apparently the reason they don't do this is that it would also cause such a tidal wave that it would drown Peking and put the Gobi Desert about 8 feet underwater. Now, the moral of the story is simply this. There is a price to be paid for everything. Nothing is free, and the NATO troops are no exception. We have at least 3 problems. The first is the cost. Senator Mike Mansfield, in March of 1973, indicated that over $17 billion goes to support NATO at the expense of our balance of payments. Now, at a time when imported oil is more critical than ever, when more social spending on everything from prison reform to better transit could be made, we are spending $17 billion needlessly in Western Europe in a situation where they could defend themselves. The second problem, however, is perhaps more severe, and that is the drug problem in Western Europe. The 300,000-man U.S. fighting force in Germany has been severely impaired by drug users, criminals, and their victims, that coming from U.S. News of last year. They conclude, it is estimated that about 10% of the GIs in West Germany are addicted to drugs, and that from 60 to 80% have experimented. Now, the addiction rate among U.S. citizens in general is about 0.1%. The rate among U.S. soldiers in Europe, then, is fully 100 times that at home. You are confronted once again with a policy which commits those 300,000 men over there with an addiction rate of 100 times American. And we simply do not need that because they can defend themselves, as I have indicated before. I would argue finally, however, that the only excuse for our presence in Western Europe is for a fast response, a flexible response, so we don't immediately have to resort to nuclear weapons. I believe this is fatuous for a couple of reasons. The first is, if you believe that our present level of troops is adequate, we don't need to station them over there. We can transport them with incredible speed. Now, Mr. Webb indicated it would take 30 to 60 days for the Russians to man an invasion. Please listen to Professors of International Relations Paddleford and Lincoln in the book Dynamics of International Policy. Military power is no longer local. The Economist, noting the new U.S. C-5A air military transport, commented that 42 of these planes could lift a division to Europe in a half a day. For the first time, an army and everything it conceivably use, including its vehicles, its helicopters, and the rest, can be flown rapidly across the world. We've already got 47 of these C-5As. You are confronted with a situation where we have 300,000 men, that is 4 1/3 divisions. You could get those 4 1/3 divisions at 1 division every half day there in 2 days. Yet we don't do that. We leave them over there forever, causing the drug problem 100 times, causing the balance of payments problem, causing the problem that does not make the Western Europeans, the richest countries in the world, pay for their own defense. This is a vacuous, legally and argumentatively policy, which I think we should reject today. I would argue, secondly, however, that regardless of the number of troops we have a state of disarray and unpreparedness over there, offering no nuclear stopgap. new republic of October 1973. In addition to being outnumbered, American troops are inadequately prepared. It's not uncommon, for example, for an infantry company to experience an almost complete personnel turnover in a year. Asked in January 72 about the readiness of the 3rd Armored Division at Frankfurt, the commander, Major General William Craft, remarked, "If you take 75 as a passing score of the 23 battalions in the division, 5 or 6 are above passing. The rest would be below passing in various degrees." The same article concluded that in terms of conventional power, the 4 and a 3rd divisions of the U.S. Army are a poor match for the 31 Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe. Please examine the scenario. You are confronted with a present system which thinks we have all the troops we need in Western Europe today, and that is 4 and a 3rd divisions. They wouldn't think it was not enough, or else they would put more in. I can get you those 4 and a 3rd divisions in just over 2 days. We do not need to have them there today. But the fact of the matter is that 4 and a 3rd divisions are totally inadequate. You have 31 Soviet divisions staring you in the face. And as a result, it will not be a deterrent to nuclear war. We will have to go to nuclear war just as quickly. You are confronted with a present system which commits these people unnecessarily. I would conclude finally that if you look at the Western Europe troops today, you can take them out and get $17 billion and virtually solve the social problems we are confronted with today if it can be redirected. In Plato's allegory of the cave, man's reluctance to change is manifested in his willingness to accept images, mere phantoms of the unreal in place of truth. I think that's what we've been doing in America for the last 20 years. The situation has evolved and changed, but our policy has not. For the sake of 300,000 Americans, for the sake of $17 billion that could be spent better elsewhere, I would suggest that we withdraw from Europe all military personnel immediately.